I could totally understand finishing the book The Killer Angels and thinking, fuck, this would make a great movie. And it seems almost sacrilegious to make big changes to such a powerful piece of fiction. But that said, film and literature are very different art forms, and the things that make for great literature don't necessarily make for very compelling cinema. I think that's very much the case with the film adaptation of The Killer Angels, the 1993 film Gettysburg. In all his Civil War movies, director Ron Maxwell completely disregards traditional story structure, so he can pack as much history into his films as he possibly can. And I'm sure that's completely intentional. I suspect he cares much more about getting the history right than adhering to the rules of visual storytelling. In his mind, that's a bold artistic choice. But that doesn't work for me. As far as I'm concerned, if you're going to throw away a millennia-old tradition of visual storytelling dating back to ancient Greek theater, then you need to develop an original and unconventional aesthetic to match your original and unconventional approach to the narrative. I watch Gettysburg and I see a disappointing lack of creativity in the cinematography and editing. Camera angles are flat, and the blocking feels very staged. During battles, you don't get any sense at all of the ferocity and unpredictability of a real combat situation. And in dialogue scenes, the filmmaking is bland and unadventurous. Wide master shots, singles, shot reverse shot. There's just not that much going on. And that's fine. Not everything has to reinvent the wheel. But I think it's very telling. It says something about Ron Maxwell's approach to his work. When he makes a choice that's just inexplicable and bad, he's being bold and transgressive. But in just about every other way, his artistic choices are by the numbers, seen it before 1,000 times, boring. Now, you might very well say that real life doesn't conform to story structure, and that showing the complete sequence of events at the Battle of Gettysburg necessitates doing away with it. But the thing is, neither the book nor the film come even close to telling the whole story of the battle. Fuck, you'd be hard-pressed to do that over a 12-hour season of television. However, Gettysburg still bites off way more than it can chew, to the detriment of the narrative. Not just in regards to telling the story of the battle itself, but also in its attempts to reveal the beliefs of the soldiers involved, and to tell us about the causes for which they're fighting. They should have narrowed the scope of the book when writing the screenplay of the movie. Every minute spent dwelling on the larger political issues of the Civil War is a minute that could have been better used telling more awesome stories from the Battle of Gettysburg itself. But, I hear you thinking, they did narrow the scope. Like you said yesterday, of all the incredible stories from the Battle of Gettysburg, they only chose to focus on Buford's story, and Chamberlain's, and Lee's, and Longstreet's, and Hancock's, and Armistead's, and Pickett's, and this guy's. With almost 200,000 stories to choose from, that's a pretty short list. True, but I'm arguing that they didn't go far enough. Gettysburg should have been about a regiment. A single one. And of that regiment, most of our characters should have been from a single company. Just young kids trying to make it through the Battle of Gettysburg in one piece. You could make a 3-hour movie just about that. And in the film's portrayal of the second day of the battle, you can see glimpses of the laser-focused, airtight masterpiece that Gettysburg could have been. The decision to show the events of this day's fighting almost entirely from Chamberlain's perspective was an excellent one, and in my opinion, these scenes are by far the best in the movie. But we'll get more into that later. First, some historical context. So by dawn of the second day, both the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia had drawn up into the positions they would more or less occupy for the rest of the battle. General Meade, who if you'll remember shows up for 90 seconds in the movie and is never seen again, adopted the famous fishhook formation, with his Federals well entrenched on high ground, especially at the flanks. At this point, Robert E. Lee was pretty pissed at General Ewell for not taking the strategic heights on Culp's Hill on the first day, despite the fact that Lee's orders to him were confusing and contradictory. Take the hill if practicable, but do not bring on a general engagement. Sounds a whole lot like don't take the hill to me, but and I get what Lee was trying to say, but it's hard to blame Ewell too much here. And I mean, that said, from Lee's end too. Neither army had a plan going into the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Confederate High Command had basically no intelligence about United States positions. So, maybe we shouldn't judge Lee too harshly either. Despite the Union defeat on July 1st, Meade had successfully outmaneuvered Lee, but it wasn't too late for the Confederates to turn it around. The Federals had a good position, and they would likely be hesitant to abandon it. So theoretically, the Confederates could just avoid battle altogether, go clear around Meade's army, and continue their march toward Washington. As the movie shows, Longstreet repeatedly urged Lee to disengage with the enemy and find more advantageous ground elsewhere, but Lee insisted on an immediate attack. This is actually one aspect of the Killer Angels historiography that I like. namely the rehabilitation of James Longstreet. After the war, Longstreet infamously joined the Republican Party and advocated for cooperation with the federal forces that occupied the South during Reconstruction. It wasn't exactly a change of heart. At the end of the day, Longstreet wanted what most ex-Confederates wanted, namely a return to the antebellum status quo and the disenfranchisement of black Southerners for the benefit of rich white Southerners.
We should have freed the slaves, then fired on Fort Sumter.
What? But while most Southern Democrats used terror and violence to achieve these ends, Longstreet preferred a more Machiavellian approach. He believed that by cooperating with the Federals, ex-Confederates could infiltrate the Republican Party, control the African-American vote in the South, and use it for their own ends. But no matter his intentions, Longstreet collaborating with the enemy, to say nothing of vocally criticizing Lee's leadership during the war, did not exactly endear him to his former comrades. In the early 1870s, Jubal Early began claiming that on the night of July 1st at Gettysburg, Lee had told Ewell, Early, and Robert Rhodes that Longstreet was under strict orders to attack at dawn on the 2nd. Longstreet didn't attack until the afternoon of the 2nd, which Early claimed was culpable disobedience. This was a total lie. Lee didn't decide on a battle plan until the morning of the 2nd. He didn't even know for sure where the Federal left flank ended until Longstreet's attack had already commenced. The two other witnesses to this imaginary conversation, Rhodes and Ewell, were conveniently dead. So it was Early's word against Longstreet. And as far as most white Southerners were concerned, Longstreet was a filthy scallywag. So blame for the Confederate loss at Gettysburg landed squarely on his shoulders. I don't think Longstreet was like an amazing guy or anything, but 100 years of unjust blame for the biggest missed opportunity in American military history, that's harsh by any standard. Had Lee been alive when Early was slandering Longstreet, I'm pretty sure he would have come to the defense of his old warhorse and accepted full responsibility for the defeat. That's just the kind of man he was. But who's to say? Anyway, the fighting on July 2nd began when General Dan "the Man" Sickles, commanding the Union 3rd Corps, sent a reconnaissance force of elite sharpshooters under Hiram Berdan to scope out the Confederate positions. The sharpshooters encountered Confederates massing in force in Pitzer's Woods, about a half-mile west of the Union line. Sickles, deciding that his current position was untenable for defense, decided to move his whole corps forward into a place called the Peach Orchard, which offered some higher ground. In the process, he opened up huge fucking gaps in the Union line, a mistake that Longstreet gleefully exploited. This tasty snack, Porter Alexander, opened up an artillery barrage on Sickles' own batteries, and Confederate infantry swarmed in for the kill. Understandably, Meade was pissed, but considering that combat was already underway, he ordered Sickles to defend his new position, and brought up reserves of 5th Corps infantry to plug the holes in the line. After Meade's review of the 3rd Corps, General Warren, the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac, rode up to Little Round Top and found it unoccupied by troops from either side. He immediately recognized the strategic significance of the hill, and diverted 2 5th Corps brigades under Colonel Strong Vincent and General Stephen Weed to set up a defensive line on the summit. As Meade and Warren shifted troops around, Longstreet and Sickles continued to batter one another, with scenes of unimaginable carnage at places like Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, and the aptly named Slaughter Pen. At around 4:30 p.m., General John Bell Hood, leading a division of Confederates on Longstreet's far right, was severely wounded. Command of his division passed to one General Evander Law. Law, by all accounts, did not properly coordinate the rest of the attack, which was sloppy and rudderless. He had also failed to appoint a successor for his old brigade, which was now leaderless and marching right into Weed and Vincent's positions on Little Round Top. This is where the movie starts showing us the events of the second day. We see Colonel Vincent impress upon Chamberlain the importance of the Union left, followed by the 20th Maine's dust-up with the 15th Alabama. I love this scene, mainly because it's the only battle sequence in the movie told entirely from the perspective of characters I give a shit about. I like Armistead and Longstreet just fine as characters, but the only characters I love are Lawrence, Tom, and Buster. Their scenes feel the most cinematically compelling, by which I mean their arcs form a cohesive story. We get to know them.
Darn it, Tom, don't call me Lawrence.
Root for them when they're in danger, and watch them grow and change. Moments like this
Tom!
are genuinely tense and exciting. Not because they're exceptionally well shot or anything, but because you actually give a shit about the fates of these characters. A lot of that comes from the book, but the performances really drive it home. Making a film on a low budget kind of forces you to focus on character development rather than spectacle. Gettysburg was made for $20 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's $36 million in today's money. So, pennies. And Gettysburg does sort of feel like a historical epic held together with duct tape. And I actually love that about it. I wish that all the battles had this kind of emphasis on character development. Most of the battles in Gettysburg exist in a weird vacuum, completely separate from the plot of the movie. They don't feature characters we know or care about. The fighting on the first and much of the second day is shown with bizarre cutaways to pudgy reenactors exchanging pot shots. The most baffling of these cutaways is the representation of the fighting at Devil's Den, where we see a few Billy Yanks trying their best not to slip on the rocks in their brogans. Why did this shot make it into the movie? Aren't these guys like fighting in a war? Wouldn't they be hurtling themselves off this rock to escape from the advancing enemy? I mean, fuck, I'd rather break a leg, even knowing it'll probably get sawn off later, than let myself fall into the hands of these filthy rebs. There's just no urgency at all here. No stakes, no emotional investment. I like Sam Elliott just fine, but I could give two shits about General Buford. I don't know the guy. He shows up, growls out some cynical dialogue, and starts shooting some graybacks. I certainly don't care about John Reynolds. Hi, Reynolds. Bye, Reynolds. I really only have one criticism of the little round top scene, and it's mostly pedantic. Namely that, like Buford, I think the movie accidentally overemphasizes the 20th Maine's importance. They weren't that crucial to the Union victory, and yet that's a common misconception that a lot of people have. Now, I'm not necessarily trying to knock Chamberlain here. He fought well, and the bayonet charge was fucking dope. He deserved the Medal of Honor for that. But I do strenuously object to the idea that the 20th Maine single-handedly saved the entire Army of the Potomac from certain destruction. The thing is, this whole stretch of the Union left was under an incredible amount of pressure. The Confederate attack on Little Round Top was tenacious, and just because the slope in front of Vincent and Weed's commands was rocky and steep, as opposed to the more gently rolling section that Chamberlain defended, doesn't mean that they had it much easier. I think the main reason that Chamberlain is a household name today, while Vincent and Weed are mere historical footnotes, is because Vincent and Weed died that day. Well, they didn't die. They got mortally wounded and then died later, but whatever. Poor General Weed, dead in a purplish haze of gunsmoke, his eyes slowly turning red with blood as he breathed his last. Oh, General Weed, we shall smoke our pipes continuously in your loving memory. But Chamberlain did a lot more to secure his place in American history than just survive. He also wrote prolifically and spoke about his wartime experiences publicly on many occasions. He had a wildly successful career after the Civil War, being governor of Maine and president of Bowdoin College. Artist James Kelly claimed that General Oliver Howard once told him, speaking of Chamberlain,
"We never thought Chamberlain would amount to anything. He got married and became a teacher and did very well. He then went to the war and we said, now he will fail. But he became, before the war ended, a very good soldier. After the war, he became president of Bowdoin College and we said, now he will fail surely. But he became one of the best presidents the college ever had. Then he was made governor and we said, now he shall surely fail. But he wrote good messages and they elected him 3 terms.
And even now, 100 years after his death, his reputation doesn't have a scratch on it. And it's not entirely due to the movie, but it sure didn't hurt either. And thanks in part to him, as well as many other officers and men in the Army of the Potomac, the Federal line would hold against Longstreet's attack on the second day. But the action on the Union left is only half the tale. On the Union right, A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell's corps were also hotly engaged that day, trying their damnedest to dislodge the Yankees from their defensive positions on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge. On Cemetery Ridge, a disjointed defensive line of men from General Winfield Hancock's 2nd Corps faced a fucking terrifying attack from a horde of Rebs. Well, not a horde exactly, but about a division and a half of Confederate infantry. The Yankees had insufficient numbers here to mount an effective defense. Meade had sent most of the reserves that he had on hand to reinforce the left flank. The Confederates marched implacably forward, and Cadmus Wilcox's brigade broke through the Union lines at the Emmitsburg Road. In a panic, Hancock grabbed the first unengaged Union force he could find and ordered them to plug the gap. This force was the 1st Minnesota Infantry. Hancock ordered them to charge Wilcox's line without delay. Let me make sure you understand exactly what's going on here. Hancock was commanding this understrength regiment, 262 men, to bayonet charge a brigade of 1,700 men. They knew they were going to their deaths. They knew that what was expected of them was to sacrifice themselves, to buy Hancock a little bit of time. But they went anyway, without hesitation. The 1st Minnesota fixed bayonets and hurtled themselves at the enemy under heavy fire. In some Ride of the Rohirrim type shit, they fucking shattered Wilcox's line and fought alone until a regiment of New Yorkers was able to come up and support them. Wilcox called for reinforcements too, but none came. The Minnesotans halted the momentum of his attack. The fight lasted for about 15 minutes. In that time, the 1st Minnesota suffered an 82% casualty rate. Why wasn't that in the movie? Why didn't we get to see these men charging headlong into overwhelming odds, shattering slavers' skulls with every swing of their stainless steel testicles? Meanwhile, at the extreme right of the Union fishhook, Ewell was discovering that taking Culp's Hill was by no means practicable. Lee had ordered him to attack at 3 p.m. to draw Federal troops away from Longstreet's main attack on the Union left. But Ewell didn't hear the thunder of Longstreet and Hill's artillery until 4 p.m., and only then ordered a bombardment of United States positions. Ewell kept up artillery fire for 3 hours, before finally committing his infantry at 7 p.m., pretty close to sundown. By this time, Longstreet's assault had already lost momentum, so the attack on Culp's Hill completely failed to enact Lee's strategy. But considering the odds that they were up against, these entrenched Yankees in very strong defensive positions, really can't help but marvel at how brave these Confederate soldiers were. At one point, General George Stewart's brigade overran Federal defenses and seized control of their breastworks, but failed to capitalize on their victory. Unfortunately for Stewart, he had no idea that unguarded Union supply trains were massed on the Baltimore Pike only a few hundred yards away from him. If Stewart had pressed his attack just a little bit further, he would have struck a tremendous blow to the Army of the Potomac. At 10 p.m., the fighting finally died down. Stewart still occupied part of the hill, but most Confederates were repulsed. The situation was confused and uncertain in the dark, though it was clear that the carnage would continue in the morning. Here's a tip for all you indie filmmakers out there. If you want to make a Gettysburg movie on the cheap, set it on Culp's Hill on the evening of the second day. In the dark, you can make 40 extras look like 200, and the little flashes of musketry in the dark would be, a pretty cool little visual thing. I give this idea to you for free. Give me a story credit or something. And again, there are about 1 million stories that I'm just glossing over here. I mean, I would love to tell you about Wesley Culp, for instance, who was born in Gettysburg and then moved to Virginia, joined the Confederate Army, and according to legend, died trying to take the very hill that bore his family name. But there is no time for that. There is no time. The second day of battle ended in defeat for the Confederates, though it was an incredibly near thing.
They nearly broke. I could feel them breaking. And there for a moment I thought I saw our flags go up the hill.
This might be a controversial opinion, but I actually really like Martin Sheen as Robert E. Lee. This might be my favorite depiction of Lee in all of historical fiction, with the possible exception of Harry Turtledove's Guns of the South. It's a super complex portrayal, and he's full of paradoxes. He's honorable and ruthless, restrained and deeply emotional, humble and arrogant. He isn't unjustly deified or unduly demonized. He's just a person who happens to be in command of 70,000 men. The scene where Lee chews out Jeb Stuart is another one that I really love. You get a wonderful sense of both these men's personalities, and Martin Sheen's acting is fucking dope here. I love how he's got this simmering anger that just explodes, but then he catches himself and turns his rebuke into constructive criticism. And that's an important life lesson. You're not going to change somebody's mind by yelling at them and cataloging their faults. No, you've got to try to see things from their perspective. That'll always be more constructive. And I know that's something that I could be better at, specifically when I criticize Ron Maxwell, but it's never too late to change. And I hope that I can, going forward, criticize with compassion rather than hatred. It is the opinion of some excellent Civil War buffs that you have let us all down.
Well, I think one of the fundamental obligations of the filmmaker is to be a truth teller.
There will be none of that. There is no time.
If you look at our society, our human society...
There is no time, Mr. Maxwell. Your mission was to direct a quality prequel to the film Gettysburg. That mission was not fulfilled. Instead, you gave us gods and generals, which is as historically inaccurate as it is insufferably boring. You have reinforced lost cause historiography and propagated myths about the benevolence of slavery. Sir, it is only by God's grace that you did not set the public's view of the Civil War back decades.
There's a pressure on artists, whether they be filmmakers or other kinds of storytellers, to conform to the adverse effects of political correctness.
Perhaps you misunderstood my orders? Perhaps I did not make myself clear. Well, this, sir, must be made very clear. You, with your movies, are considered an authority of Civil War history. When you make a shitty film, and get your facts wrong, you do damage to historical education. That has already happened once. It must never, ever happen again.
Over the 25 or so years altogether that I was working on Gettysburg.
I have told you there is no time for that! There is no time! There are not enough Civil War films being made today. And we need you. Lord knows we need you. I know your quality. You are a smart man, and your service to historical cinema has been invaluable. You must take what I have told you and learn from it, as a man does. There has been a mistake. It will not happen again. Now, let us speak no more of it.